mean to be superstitious? What are the characteristics of being superstitious? And does an intellectual belief in God and Christianity, is that the same thing as superstition?
Yeah, the superstitious, they also use the term pre-scientific.
Yeah.
And they use it as being synonymous with gullible. So it would be like, ancient, primitive man. Primitive, they'll also use that word too. But they'll act as if, they'll act as if these, like primitive peoples who had no idea of science, there's an earthquake, and so they think, okay, there's an earthquake, therefore the gods must be angry with us, and they're messing with us. There's a flood, and the gods are angry. And it's just like it's a God of the gaps mentality. We have a gap in knowledge. We don't know what the cause is, so we invoke God. But that's really not the case. Even like the arguments.
That's how you define superstition.
Yeah.
As the gaps.
Yeah. And it's just ignorance. It's belief based on ignorance. I would argue that Christianity is based on what we know, like the design argument. We know there's evidence of design, and we argue to an intelligent designer. The cosmological argument, we know the universe had a beginning. Whatever has a beginning needs a cause. So whatever the case, I would reject that. But it's also the idea that the apostles were pre-scientific and had no understanding of natural laws, and were so gullible that they believed Jesus came back to life, that dead bodies could come back to life. Well, then that doesn't explain the start of Christianity, because they had to have a pretty decent knowledge of natural laws, enough to know that dead bodies are supposed to stay dead, so that when Jesus' dead body didn't stay dead and he came back to life, they recognized it as a miracle. You don't recognize it as a miracle unless you recognize, in other words, the apostles were not so gullible that they expected Jesus to rise. When he rose, it shocked them, and that's why they believed, okay, he is God, we need to worship him.
I mean, even look at the example where Jesus raised the little girl back to life. And she's like, oh, she's not dead, she's just sleeping. And that was the first thing they said to him was, don't you think that we know if one of our people is dead or not? She's obviously not sleeping, she's dead. So right there was an example of, obviously, we know when something is not alive.
Yeah, and so the ancients that held to that believed in miracles, you just can't automatically rule them out as pre-scientific, because miracles presupposes a background of natural law. See, the atheists try to act like it's either natural laws or miracles. You can't have both. It's like, who says? And in fact, Thomas Aquinas gives an outstanding argument for God's existence based on natural laws. So I would argue you can't have either without God. That if the mindless things of nature move in accordance towards the same goals, then that shows that there's a mind governing the affairs of nature. And then if this mind chooses to get our attention, what better way than to supersede the laws of nature? And that's exactly what a miracle is. So the argument that they were superstitious, pre-scientific, that presupposes that atheism is true, and anybody who believes in this stuff would be an ignoramus. These guys, people don't die, for hoaxes and all. So these guys really believed in what they saw. They weren't writing mythology. C.S. Lewis showed us that. They were telling you who the governor was, who the Caesar was. They were recording eyewitness events, and these guys aren't going to die for mythology. So this is stuff they claim to be eyewitnesses and really believe that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. And so to compare the God of the Bible, or even just the theistic God with the flying spaghetti monster, it's just absurd. It's just, when's the last time Dawkins and Hitchens have made lots and lots of money debating probably 3 or 4 Christians a month for the past few years? When's the last time they debated someone who was arguing for the existence of the flying spaghetti monster? So it's not a good analogy.
Obviously, it's not on the same part. So they say it's superstitious because there's like not enough evidence, and they'll basically say that Christianity is not intellectual. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, no, not at all. And there's some of the most brilliant people today, as throughout history. I mean, all the founders of modern science were Bible-believing Christians. But presently, like you have like Francis Collins, who headed the Human Genome Project. He's not a fan of intelligent design, but he at least understood that science cannot explain everything, and it can't explain morality. So C.S. Lewis's moral argument for God that led him to believe in God, and eventually he became a Roman Catholic.
I think it's kind of funny too. Is when Anthony Flew became a deist, and then you have Dawkins talking about that, and he says, Dawkins says, Anthony Flew used to be a smart guy.
Yeah.
So it was just that's the one area in his mind that defines intellectualism.
Yeah.
You can be the most brilliant guy in the world, in quantum physics and all this stuff like that, or neuroscience. Yeah. But if you make that shift from atheism to even deism, you've immediately lost all intelligibility.
Yeah, and Dawkins devotes about 3 or 4 pages to trying to refute Aquinas' arguments, and all he shows is that he just hasn't really read Aquinas or doesn't really understand Aquinas. Eddie Tabash does not understand simultaneous causation, and not only can you not understand Aquinas without understanding that, but you can't understand the Aristotelian causation often involves simultaneous causation. So many atheists believe that a cause has to precede its effect in time. So if time began, they couldn't have a cause because there'd be no time before time began. And that's just that totally of what Aristotle believed in the unmoved mover, the cause of the universe, yet he believed the universe was eternal. So it had nothing to do with the cause preceding in time the effect. And so Aristotelian causation there for the origin of the universe had nothing to do with it wasn't a temporal thing. So these guys are actually showing that they're not as intelligent, or at least as educated as many of the Christian thinkers and even ancient Greek philosophers when it comes to one type of causation. I mean, if they can't get the concept, what can we do? I mean, we can't. You can explain it only so many times. If they just don't get it, they don't get it. But whatever the case, these people that they're calling primitive, the ancients, both the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Greeks, going back hundreds of years before Jesus, understood that you needed something more than the physical realm to account for human knowledge. So the Hebrews said, in God's light, the psalmist said, in God's light we see light. The ancient Greeks, they looked at the physical world, they rejected Thales and the Milesian school, who were trying to explain everything by mere material causes alone. And they said, no, there's got to be something, some rational principle that governs nature, makes sense out of the world of change, and gives our minds the ability to know, to have real knowledge about the world. And they call that the Logos, the Word. And so whether it was the ancient Greeks or the ancient Hebrews, they were smart enough to know you can't just have reason hanging there. It's not just a given. There's got to be some explanation beyond the physical world for it. And but the Greek explanation was kind of weak. Was like what's this non-personal, rational mind called the Logos? Well, John pulled the best of Hebrew thought and the best of Greek thought together and said, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and the Logos became flesh. And of course he was talking about God, the second person of the Trinity, become a man. Well, that's brilliant, and so these are not primitive people. These are brilliant Jews and brilliant Greeks, and they saw what many of these atheists do not see. They act like these things are given, reason, morality. That's not the case. They're not givens, and most atheist philosophers would probably agree that they're not givens. If God doesn't exist, then there's no absolute morality, and there's no laws of logic lose any basis for themselves as well.
So now you mentioned this before, and it's a perfect segue for right now. Is Christianity, or well, let me ask, does science disprove God? That's one of your chapters, chapter number 3. You mentioned the founders of modern science were Christians, but they would say science disproves God. So who's right here?
Well, the founders of modern science are right. Today, most of today's scientists are very specialized, so that once they step outside their particular field, if their field is geology, once they get away from rocks, they know that if they haven't read up on it, they may not know anything about astronomy or cosmology or whatever. But the founders of modern science were very brilliant men, and they thought of doing science as thinking God's thoughts after Him. The whole reason for the founding of modern science was there was a confidence in the Christian worldview that the ancient Greeks never had. The ancient Greeks would study, Aristotle did science, but he knew that there was really no basis, no guarantee that the knowledge he was getting was any real knowledge from the physical world, from the world of the senses. But Bible-believing Christians realized that a rational God created man in His image, so man is a rational being, and created the world in a way that makes sense so that through reason man could find out about the universe in which he lives. So in other words, the Christian worldview, the Christian God, the theistic God, formed the foundation for modern science because it guaranteed that science was a worthwhile endeavor. And so that's why I say that the validity of reason, the validity of human reason and the intelligibility of the universe make much more sense in a theistic universe than in an atheistic universe. It makes no sense at all that the universe would be intelligible and that human reason would be valid. So now when you look at the... So these guys believed that they were thinking God's thoughts after Him. And when you look at you've got to separate origin science from operation science, and most scientists don't even realize that there's a difference.
What is the difference between those?
Operation science deals with ongoing processes of the present. And that's where you start the so-called scientific method, which is not the only scientific way to find truth. But the scientific method starts with observation, and then you end up coming up with a theory, a hypothesis, and then you test it. But that deals with present, ongoing processes. But there are singular events of the past, like the supposed evolutionary changes of the past, or the supposed creation by God. The Big Bang itself would be a singularity. It's referred to often as a Big Bang singularity. So it's not something that could be observed. The expansion of the universe, if that can be observed, that's still not the Big Bang. That would be an effect of the Big Bang. So besides operation science, there's origin science, which deals with singular events, non-repeatable events of the past. And some would say, well, then that's not science. Well, then you just threw forensic science out the window, crime scene investigation. And so we can
anthropology
we can use circumstantial evidence to find, archaeology and so we can use circumstantial evidence to argue for something. So you can't start to start with the so-called scientific method because there's no observation going on. But instead, what you can do is you can say you can use two principles, and this is what scientists have done dealing with origin science. The principle of uniformity or analogy, which is basically the present, gives us some information about the past, So, and what that means is